There's a whole bunch of questions here. So Gabriel Keating says, Karsten touched on the importance of different lifestyles among political decision making. The UK government have recently announced a drastic relaxation of the social restrictions for the Christmas period, however, did not have the same response to protect other religious holidays. What do you all think this is doing to the image of the government on those already feeling alienated throughout this pandemic? Do you think this will promote more support for weaker voices or further the binaries between us and them? I think we will take that. I think the next question is quite different one. So we will come to the next question. So Karsten, the question is for you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So we seem to really have very similar discourses in all of the three countries regarding the homonormative, the heteronormative, politics surrounding COVID restrictions. As Niharika just pointed out, kind of many of these things are also true for the German context. So the question, what is an household? How many people can you see? And to which lifestyles are these restrictions catered? What is the norm the rule makers had in their heads when they wrote down these regulations? And it is also very clear for the German setup that the norm is the traditional heteronormative family. We have now new regulations that 2 households can meet and up to 10 people. That fits very nicely for 2 standard families of 2 parents and 2 children who meet up. And it doesn't fit very well for singles in urban environments who don't live with anybody, or maybe who live in a flat share but don't have a connection to the people they live in the flat share with, as in many cities with dense rental markets, it is the situation. So these people get extremely lonely, and kind of the boundaries in which you can have social contacts are just not enough for them. And it is exactly what this is exactly what Gabriel pointed out with regards to Christmas. So we have the same situation in Germany. The politicians want to save Christmas, and therefore we have stricter regulations now with the hope to have a relief at Christmas. And there is no debate about how this is implicitly transporting what the Germans like to call Leitkultur, so leading culture, and that it is kind of not at all doing justice and respect for people who don't celebrate Christmas but other holidays. And as to what this does, I'm if that further reinforces the us and them binaries, or if it will enable maybe even weaker voices to come up and speak. I'm rather a pessimist, to be honest, and I think we had some politicization coming with COVID when it comes to care work. We had a lot of discussions about how people who are working in care work are underpaid. We had a lot of discussions about that care work is unequally divided in families, and that this is reinforced through the lockdowns. We had these discussions, but nothing substantially happened. So I don't think that this question and injustice regarding the holidays specifically will change anything in the political setup, I'm afraid.
So I think we have the next question, and I will put it to both speakers. I might take the spotlight off of you, Karsten. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I can do a gallery view here, but yeah, I might leave it there. So Nisha Zadi, I think, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, thank you for the organization and speakers. My question is to both panelists. How do you think the imminent process of protection through vaccination will be carried out? Can we consider the biopolitics involved in how states will mobilize and how the public will engage with the process? Should we, Niharika, do you want to address that first, and then we'll come back to Karsten? So yeah.
I'll just quickly, briefly just give some examples as they come when I read this question. So thank you, Nisha, for that. Essentially, I won't speculate about how the process is going to be, but from seeing what is happening. So I'm thinking of this instance in India, and there are, smaller state elections that were happening, and the leader of the ruling party and the prime minister also made this declaration that people from this particular state will get free vaccines. So I'm also thinking, suddenly all the other states are not made such promises, and how COVID in itself becomes a tool towards certain political ends, and how it is basically used and deployed towards furthering an agenda that already always existed, and for populist mechanisms also. So I'm also thinking of the differences that Karsten pointed out between populisms and democratic biopolitics, and how those link here, even from the perspective of the state, in terms of what it does and the promises a ruling setup in a state can make with regard to vaccination, and how the process will unfold. So that's an interesting sort of, just laying that point out there, that there is a possibility and it's always already visible.
Karsten,
yes.
Respond, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So we are, I want to say two things about that. On the one hand, from the very traditional perspective of biopolitics, vaccinating the population is very, very classical biopolitics. This is kind of one of the things exactly meant by this. And then traditionally, scholars of biopolitics would see kind of the power structures at work, how the state nudges or forces people to take the vaccination, etc., and see that with generally very power skeptical, maybe even a slightly anti-statist general theoretization and tonality of critique. In fact, half a year ago, when we were discussing the pandemic in a working group, we read a text of a historian about vaccination, and this was exactly the state critical perspective, seeing vaccination programs as in tendency limiting the freedom of people, etc. So I would like to have the reflections of democratic biopolitics, which I introduced, exactly to shift away from seeing biopolitics only as this top-down logic where the state is generally the bad guy, and having a more nuanced view where it's clear that we need a certain kind of biopolitics, even though biopolitics is intrinsically dangerous. Therefore, this introduction of the term democratic biopolitics, which gives more attention to the agencies of political actors involved than a traditional Foucauldian analysis would have it. And I think this example, where it's clear to all of us that we need this vaccine and we want the state to deliver it, is a good example for that, because here it's very obvious that it's not just bad biopolitics when the state is implementing a vaccination program. The second thing is that the contemporary biopolitics, and I researched that with the case of HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis in another paper, is intrinsically linked to the TRIPS regulated international patent law regulating the profits from pharmaceutical products. And this is an extreme business of exploitation, especially the global north exploiting the global south, often the vaccination trials and medical trials are done in the global south, and then the medicine is sold by Western companies for enormous profits. And so we have a huge problem with this neoliberal order of international patent laws, which is regulating this. And I am afraid that the COVID situation, as exceptional it might look, is not a crisis enough to really shatter the very stable and also adaptable underlying capitalist and neoliberal structures. So I don't think that we can expect a kind of just distribution of this vaccine, but a highly differentiated with vulnerable and weak actors or living in not that powerful states will not profit from the vaccine quickly.
Thanks, Karsten. Karen, would you like me to take another question?
I'm happy either way, Goldie. Yeah, go for it.
Another question here, and then after that, I think I have a half formulated question which I might ask. But let me see. The last question here is, hello, thank you for your amazing speeches. So it's a question from somebody named Zed Chen. My questions are for both speakers. How could we understand the subject of freedom when so many people keep asking for it during this pandemic time? Is there structural racism inside the global vulnerability? So it feels like there are two questions there. How do we understand freedom when people keep asking for it during the time of a pandemic? And then is there a structural racism in this notion of vulnerability or global vulnerability? Again, I might move to Niharika if you would like to respond, and then Karsten. And maybe Karen, if you'd like to respond, you're free to respond as well.
I think just to find a way to respond to the question of freedom, because it's a big question, which has remained with philosophers and theorists across the board. But I think what Karsten and I tried doing was problematizing this liberal conception of freedom, because it is essentially a very individualistic concept. And what happened even in a lot of state responses was to suggest individual mechanisms also to combat coronavirus, right? So I think there is a very liberal framing of the problem and the response to the problem. So I think this conception of freedom in itself becomes problematized when that freedom is differentiated, and that's how Karsten pointed out, which I, in a way, linked with militarism to show that this is indeed, expanding the vulnerabilities or making them even deeper that already existed. So I think it's really important to start from that sort of problematization of freedom, for who, and then what underpins that. And I think these are there would be another way to respond to this question again. And I've been with these questions of political responsibility and political commitment also, right? So I think in many ways, the feminist tradition of thinking has deeply laid emphasis on the intersubjectivity and interconnectedness of human life. So this is a tradition that completely destabilizes the liberal assumption of the human, of the land. And we learned this from a lot of indigenous knowledges coming out as well, that there is, it is a very holistic relationship that is always in relation to one another. So the power that functions, that is always in relation to one another. So I think it's really just very important to just throw the light again on the issue of political commitment and political responsibility when we inherently understand lives as interconnected. So if we're asking for freedom, what are the vulnerable and marginal population who that freedom will cost to? And then what is the cost of that freedom? What freedom, at what cost does it come? And who are the essential workers who are putting in hours of frontline duties, right? So I think it's really necessary to not really silo these concepts or ideas or even ways of being, but looking at the interconnections and what are our responsibilities as political beings in the context that we're in. So I think that would be my response to the first part. And in structural racism, global vulnerability, I think definitely yes. I remember as in the initial months of the pandemic, there was this fantastic roundtable with Angela Davis, and Angela Davis pointed out, and she was so, as she always is, she was so fantastic in saying that what this moment has done is also shown us the crisis of racial capitalism, and that disputes a lot of traditional Marxist theories, which took race as not the race is not the basis of analyzing economic relations, but race became an afterthought. So I think what this present moment really tells us is how racial capitalism underpins a lot of the mess that we're in, and this perhaps is a moment that needs to be utilized. So definitely this sort of global vulnerability is deeply racialized, and in that process it's also creating more exclusion. So like I sort of tried pointing out, there's nothing given as a race or a gender. It always comes into being. So what this differentiated vulnerability also does, it produces particular gendered and particular racialized subjects for further marginalization. So I think it's really it's key to sort of draw these links together with this concept, but also what processes does it give rise to.
Thank you, Niharika. Karsten?
Yeah, thank you, Niharika. This was already a wonderful answer, and I totally agree with all what you said, especially the problem with liberal concepts of freedom. Now I have here these crazy German demonstrations which are doing exactly that, saying the state is cutting back our freedom with these pandemic measures, and the rule of law is being turned away. They are doing Nazi comparisons. Yeah, they are comparing the situation now with the Third Reich, and it's and this is all based on this liberal concept of freedom, which is negative freedom. Freedom understood as non-interference. So I'm free as long as nobody interferes into my business. And this is just a wrong understanding of freedom. And in order to, Niharika spoke about interconnectedness of lives. There are other concepts of freedom in social philosophy which are capturing exactly that. So the concept of social freedom in a Hegelian tradition that points out that we can only live in relation to others and in collaboration with others, and that freedom arises only out of the acting together in a society. So I think that it is important actually to counter these demands for negative freedom in the pandemic, to just do what one pleases with these more nuanced concepts of social freedom, and say, no, what you want is not freedom. That is kind of amoralist individualism and not a valuable concept of freedom. And then regarding the racism and what Niharika said about racial capitalism, I fully agree. And I think that the situation is kind of just making the problems which have been already there even more clear, and that the capitalist production was racialized before and is racialized now, and that therefore the global vulnerability is also racialized. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. I mean, I think I'm going to ask it really is a half formulated question, because I was thinking about it, and both of you have really helped me, or actually stimulated some of my thinking, because I'm in quite in different ways, but it's almost like this question that I have converges at a particular point. Because when, Niharika, when you speak about those us and them binaries, and when you speak about populist biopolitics, at the heart of it is also nationalisms. right? So, and it also makes me think about when we, you know, how do we reimagine how we want to live? I mean, Niharika mentioned indigenous knowledges, and Karsten, you just now talked about, you know, thinking together and interconnectedness. So for me, the structure, it's not just the state as a regulatory biopolitical manager, if you will. You know, at the heart of this is this combination that we live in, the idea of the nation state. And I think that informs the ways in which the pandemic management and the pushing of those inequalities, but also the military occupations, for example, of Kashmir that Niharika mentioned, or the heteropatriarchal, heteronormative state, you know, the nation. All of these function in that with reference to the nation, right? So how do we, I'm not asking you to come up with a whole different model of the state because I think that we don't have time at the moment, but maybe you can comment on that. Like, how do we reimagine? I think that affective dissonance was one thing I picked up with Niharika's work, and with your work quite, you know, explicitly you talked about democratic biopolitics. So maybe you would like to comment on that. So I might invite Niharika first and then Karsten.
Honestly, Goldie, I wish we could just have, I think, year-long project of, you know, sort of trying to reformulate the state. I think that's so desperately needed. But just to, I think that's a really big question, but also so deeply at the heart of all of the discussions that we're having. This strengthening of this idea of nation state and strengthening of borders. And we've seen the interlinkages between how processes of racialization, gendering, who belongs here, who does not belong here. And we've seen that in the citizenship protests that we had in India, right? So who does it actually belong to? So I think those questions have been so deeply pertinent. But to just, you know, go back to a question that Karen also pointed out and the Gail Lewis interview that I referenced. And I think the point there lies that, you know, once you go back to the values, the world essentially that you are reimagining is beyond borders. So it breaks the border thinking, and for breaking that border thinking is to really, I think it's also there's no set sequential way of doing it, but affective dissonance, the concept, there lies a potential to at least recognize the limitations of the nation states and the borders, and to therefore go beyond and organize collectively on issues and values that we're all fighting for. So although I'm really not very hopeful of that front, because that process often stops from, you know, stops at feeling guilty and feeling angry, but it doesn't lead to a sort of collective action that we also really wish for. But I think there lies a lot of potential in overturning thinking away from the borders and just thinking of transing those borders, which are not really putting together or somehow deprivileging differences or contextual specificities. But at the same time, what are some of the overarching things or principles or values that we're fighting for? And I think there's a lot of, there's excellent work by Gloria Anzaldúa on, you know, breaking these borders, and what about those who are on borderlands, and exactly thinking from those borderlands to approach this behemoth of the state and the nation, and to continually like stop that, I think push back against what is being imposed. And it's a hard process. It's very difficult, exhausting work, but I think it's a work that has to be, you know, we have to keep doing all of this over and over.
Thank you, Karsten.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, it's a very central question, the state and the nation state, and I would like to comment on it in these two steps: state and then nation state. So regarding the state, kind of my overall positioning in the Foucauldian leftist critical political theory is to argue for a more kind of state positive approach, to take political institutions into account in thinking of radical democracy, and to not follow a theorizing which is implicitly or explicitly somewhat anarchist and against the state. Because I think for leftist politics, we need to organize in the state, and we need to, in the end, build hegemonies in state institutions. And often Foucauldian scholarship is implicitly a little bit anarchist. So this is my overall positioning in my works on Foucault on these questions of the state and political institutions. Now, for the nation state, of course, is a huge problem. It is a historically contingent form which has produced so many troubles and which shapes our political scene today. The whole problem of citizenship and refugees, etc., is kind of all connected to this question of the nation state. And in normative political theory, for a long time, there was the hope, also in legal theory, that a form of cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitical constitutionalism, which builds political structures above the state, slowly dissoluting the national state into a more just global political formation, ruled by the rule of law and somewhat better democracy. This hope or this normativity of global constitutionalism is in the last 10 years so under attack and kind of not really offering realistic hopes anymore. The EU is more and more collapsing due to authoritarian forces globally, with the United States going back from multilateralism. So I am not sure what critical political theory should do in this situation, because it's a catch situation. On the one hand, we know that the form of the nation state is so deeply problematic. On the other hand, it is probably strategically necessary to, because the global structures are weaker and weaker, to put more concentration into kind of political gains in nation state framed settings, which is then reinforcing this form. So it's not good. So probably we need what we are doing right now, kind of the global networks of critical voices to to counter the nation state form.
Thank you so much, both of you. Karen, do you want to add a few words to that, or you have any other questions?
There's nothing more I could add, possibly. I think it's been said very, quite profoundly. I mean, I just have to say, Niharika, I think that's the scholars that you mentioned were exactly who came to mind, Gloria and Zaldua, and just really going back to the scholars that continue to inspire me, the feminist transnational writers and theorists who have been speaking about these issues for so long. And I think that we, particularly now, it's pertinent to return to them in many ways and reframe their thinking, perhaps. So no, nothing more to add.
Okay, I think we have gone a bit over time, so we might stop here. But